Tonight, I'll be talking about reducing pesticide use with integrated pest management. IPM, which is how I'll refer to it and how it's usually referred to, stands for integrated pest management. So I'm just going to walk through what those words mean. Integrated means that we use multiple approaches, right? So it's not just a one size fits all approach. This is called the pyramid of IPM tactics, which we'll go through in detail. So, we start with prevention up to eradication, and it also goes up in toxicity. We have our cultural controls, our physical and mechanical controls, our biological controls, and then finally our chemical controls. Then we have the word pests. So what are pests? Well, there are three main categories of pests. We have our animals. So we have our, like these squash bugs on this pumpkin here. And we also have, especially here in Orange County, those deer who love to bother our gardens. Then we have our diseases such as downy mildew and powdery mildew. And then we have weeds such as Canada thistle. So breaking that down a little bit, when we talk about animal pests, we're talking about vertebrates. So that's deer and rodents for the most part, right? Like that little chipmunk. And then invertebrates, which can include insects, mites, and mollusks like slugs. So there's a wide range of animal pests. That's usually when people hear the word pest, usually they're thinking animal pest, but the other ones are also very important. So diseases are the second kind of pest. So that includes bacteria, fungi, like this black knot on this cherry tree, viruses. This is rose rosette disease on a rose. And as well as cultural issues. They're looped into diseases, so that's going to be nutrient deficiency, drought, flooding, other cultural things that are happening in your environment. And then finally, our weeds. So, just to let you know, weeds are an unwanted plant. So someone's weed is another one's flower. So just keep that in mind. And they're usually classified by their life cycle. So we have our summer annuals, our winter annuals, our biennials. So those life cycle takes 2 years. Our herbaceous perennials, so those always live, but they die off at the top every year. This is one of our favorite, right? Ground ivy is a herbaceous perennial. It dies back every year, but in the spring, it's up and at it. And then we have our woody perennials. So those would be trees and shrubs. Management is not control. The pests are always going to be there. We're not trying to control them. We're just trying to manage their population. So keep that in mind. Eradication is almost never possible. All right, so now we're going to get into the process. First step in the IPM process is identifying and monitoring. So it's really important that when you're gardening, when you're out and about looking at your plants, seeing what's going on with them, seeing if there's insects, if there's disease, if something's eating it, if the leaves are changing, becoming a weird color. So that's really, really important. And when you find a pest, such as these beautiful insects here, it's really important to figure out what they are. This is a Mexican bean beetle. It is actually a lady beetle, which is why probably many of you thought it was a friend. It is a lady beetle. It's just a lady beetle that is not predatory, that is herbivorous, so it's eating plants. So it appears on bean plants, and instead of eating the aphids, it eats the plant. This is a lady beetle larvae, and this is a friend. So a lot of people see this in their garden. They have no idea what it is. So this will then pupate and become an adult lady beetle. And you can see here it is a voracious eater of aphids. And so this is something that we really want in our garden. This is a stink bug, yes, but all stink bugs are not bad. This is a spine soldier bug. So it looks kind of like the brown marborate stink bug that we all hate. But if you look at it closely, if you look at its shoulders right here, they are spined. And also the legs look a lot different. The legs of our foes are, they're striped and black and white. But this is a predator, and it will take out right here. It's taking out a army worm. So yeah, this is a foe. That's why it's very important that when you see an insect in the garden or any pest, whether it's a plant or a disease, that you identify what it is. So you're not killing things or treating things that aren't actually pests. Now that you've identified your pest, great. Now we're going to learn more about it. So here we have, I found a white grub in my lawn, right? I'm having issues with my lawn. I found white grubs. That's great. Now let's learn more about them. And why do we want to do that? Well, these 3 white grubs are 3 different species. We have our Japanese beetle, which is the smallest one, followed by a European chafer, and then here we have a June bug. Now, why is it important to figure out what species they are? Well, if you have issues in your lawn, or if you find grubs in your lawn, that doesn't necessarily mean you have an issue. There's actually a threshold where you should do something about it. And it varies depending on what species you have. So if you have a Japanese beetle, you need 8 to 10 per square feet before you should consider treatment. Now the European chafer is a little bit bigger, so it's 5 to 8, and this June bug is really big, and so it's 2 to 4 per square feet. So that's why not only do you need it's really important to identify things and learn more about them so that you are aware of when it might be a good idea to treat them. It's also important to learn about the life cycle of your pests. So we're just looking at those white grubs. So here we have the life cycle of the Japanese beetle, right? So they're out and about at the end of June, July, they lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, and then we have these little larvae. And these larvae start to feed. And if you see these pink areas here, that's when the damage is occurring. So all the damage, most of the damage is occurring here in September and October. So they're very close to the surface and they're pretty small. Then in the wintertime, they dig deeper and they overwinter as larvae, and they come up in the spring. They do some feeding here in the spring, and then they pupate before they become adults. Now, you know, some people like to treat their yards for grubs in the spring here, but there really isn't a lot of feeding, even though this looks really long. This is only basically the month of June. So most of the damage has already occurred, and these are very large. The best time to treat for grubs is in the fall when they're very small and they're very close to the surface. If you're treating here in like late April or early May, they're very large and they're not close to the surface. So that's not the best time to treat. So in identifying the pest and then learning more about it, especially its life cycle, if you're going to use any treatment, whether it's a pesticide or not, you can time that well by knowing those things. All right, so the next thing is you're going to evaluate. So you have this pest. All right, do I want to treat it? Do I need to treat it? So for example, you see a bald-faced hornet. Now it's really going to depend where its nest is, depending if you want to knock it out, right? If the nest is in a tree in the back, you know, way back from your house in the woods where you never go, and it's like 30 feet up in the tree, what do you can leave it. Bald-faced hornets are great predators. They help take care of those unwanted pests. Now it's in this tree in your front yard that you walk by every day and your kids play under, you know, that would be a different, that would be a different, your evaluation would be very different. You said, we need to get rid of that, especially since my son is, you know, allergic to stings. So really, it's really, just because you find a pest doesn't mean you need to manage it, right? You have to evaluate whether it is really a problem and whether you can just coexist with it without an issue. So you find a bed bug in your house. Now, bed bugs, one is too many, right? No matter what, you find one and it's time to do some management. So it really depends on the pest. You know, it might be something different if you find spiders in your house or you find some ants. But when it comes to something like bed bugs, you know, one is too many. And so it's time to figure out what you can do to manage it. Step number 3 is prevention. We're going to go through this. Here is the pyramid of IPM tactics, and every single one of these tactics can be used in a preventative way. So we have our cultural ways, our physical and mechanical, our biological, and our chemical. And so we're going to go into great detail on the pyramid of IPM tactics, but just keep in mind that all of them can be used in a preventative way. And then finally, it's time to take our action. This is where this pyramid really comes in. If you look at this pyramid, you're going to start at the bottom, right? You don't start at the top of the pyramid, and you're going to use cultural control, physical control, biological control, and chemical control, which usually is people's first thing to do, is the last thing that you do. And using these other tactics will reduce the amount of pesticide use, just because these things, a lot of them will take care of the pests that you're trying to manage. The final step in the process is monitoring and evaluating. You know, did it work? You know, if you implement a pest management technique, it's really important to see if it worked, because if it didn't work, then you're going to have to try a different one. And if it did work, you can keep that in mind for next time you have that pest. So this is forgotten often, but it's a really important part of the process. So I have this really great graphic put out by the Entomological Society of America on the whole process. So, you know, starting off, we're going to identify and monitor and figure out what it is, learn more about it. That's where you can contact our garden helpline. If you're struggling to figure out what it is, we would love to help you figure out what it is so that you can manage it correctly. And then you need to evaluate, is this something I need to take care of it? Is the hornet nest, you know, 30 feet up in a tree, or is it in my front yard? And then you're going to do some prevention, right? So there's lots of things you can do to prevent issues. And then it's time to take action, where you're actually going to be using some management techniques. And then finally, it's really important to monitor to see, you know, what happens to the pest levels. Do they go up? Do they go down? Do they stay the same? And then, you know, it all kind of fits together, because knowing more about it will tell you, like, oh, it went away. Well, that's because it's winter and this pest dies in the winter. So maybe my tactic didn't actually work. It was just because there was a frost. So, you know, monitoring, you know, they all kind of fit all together. Now it's time to talk about IPM tactics. All right, so here is our beautiful pyramid of IPM tactics. A few things I want to point out to you. Prevention is more down at the bottom. I did mention that all things can be used for prevention, but the most preventative things are going to be our cultural controls, followed by physical, mechanical, biological, and then finally chemical would be moving towards eradication. The same thing is with toxicity, right? So your cultural controls are going to be the least toxic. Some of them have no toxicity at all. And the higher up is the more toxic that things are going to get. so this is the bottom level of our pyramid. This is where we want to start. And we're going to go through lots of different things that you can use for cultural control. The first and probably most important thing is right plant, right place, right? If you're planting a plant in the wrong place, it's never going to thrive and it's going to have pests. When plants are not happy, when they're struggling to survive, they're more susceptible to disease, they're more attractive to pests, and they're more likely to not make it. So when you're thinking about what you're going to plant, so if you had this really nice sunny front yard, you know, you're looking at what's the light availability. Does this tree in the front, does it ever shade the house, or does this get full sun? Is this the east side of the house that gets full sun all day long? What about water availability? You know, when it rains, does all the water puddle in that place? If you have a place where the water puddles, you're going to look for a plant that can deal with, with water all the time. Exposure to wind, is it the north side of your house that gets that winter winds? You know, some things don't thrive in that kind of environment. Looking at your soil type, you know, is it a sandy soil where water runs right out of it? Is it a clay soil that holds on to water? What's your hardiness zone? So here in Orange County, we're almost entirely in zone 6. And so it's really important to get plants that will do well in zone 6. You know, some things that used to grow here well, like the larch tree, you know, zone 6 it's really only up to zone 5, right? So its range is moving north. So that's not something we would recommend you plant here. But also thinking about the changing climate, right? So eventually we're going to be in zone 7. So something that, you know, just makes it in zone 6, maybe that's something, if it's a long-lived plant, you might want to get something that is going to actually thrive in zone 7 as well. Then you're also going to look at competition, like, is it growing next to a black walnut tree that puts out, you know, those chemicals that prevent other things from growing? Is it going to crowd out other things? You know, are you planting mint next to something that's just going to completely take over? And then you also want to think of like physical things like above and below ground wires, right? You know, call 411 before you dig. You don't want to have, you know, trees going into pipes, or if you're planting a tree, you don't want it to hit the overhead wires in front of your house so that they come and they, you know, mangle it with their pruning. So these are all things that you want to think about when you're planting so that you can plant something that you're setting up for optimal growing conditions. So another thing is sanitation. So when we're out in our yard, pruning, cleaning, raking, all these things, it's really important to keep sanitation in mind. It's especially important when pruning. So this woman's out pruning her roses, and she sees that some of the roses have black spot. Now, black spot is a very common fungal disease, but what you want to do when you find a disease like that is you want to start with the clean things that are disease-free, right? You want to prune all of your disease-free stuff first, and then move to your disease. So you're not spreading the disease from something into something that's clean. Also, a good technique to use is sanitizing your tools after using them, or even between cuts if you're going from, you know, clean to infected plant tissue. Another, you know, cultural controls, fertility management, right? For fertility issue, that's considered disease. You know, these bean plants definitely have some nutrient deficiency. So if you see plants that are, you know, are chlorotic, right? Their leaves are not as green as they're supposed to be, you know, it's time to get your soil tested, see what's going on. So that, because this plant is going to be more susceptible to disease, it's going to be more prone to insect infestations. So healthy plants are stronger plants. Another thing, especially when it comes to vegetable gardening, is crop rotation, right? A lot of us are growing vegetables, and it's really important that you don't grow the same thing in the same spot every year. So it's recommended that there's a 4-year rotation, right? You can also throw in cover crops with this, but it's important to kind of know what plant families there are and what plants are in those families, so that you're not, you know, the same plant family, they use the same nutrients, they carry the same diseases, they have the same insect problems. So keeping all that in mind will help you have a healthier vegetable garden. Also, crop rotation helps with weeds. So weeds tend to grow where cultivated plants have the same life cycle. So this is a strawberry bed. And if you look here, there's dandelions and there's horsetail. These are perennial weeds. This is a perennial bed. You know, strawberries last for a while. So when these strawberries are done, you want to move them somewhere else. And if you put an annual crop in it, these weeds will, you know, eventually be killed off because you'll be changing what's growing in all the time. So, you know, that's another reason for crop rotation, is good for good weed management. Another reason for crop rotation is disease. You know, that's one of the reasons that you're changing between plant families. So this poor tomato plant has early blight. Now, there are lots of other tactics that you can use to help save the plant. Early blight is usually not lethal to the plant. And if you use the physical control of picking off all these leaves and making sure that you come to this plant last, right, so that sanitation issues, you're not spreading it, and then you remove this plant matter from your garden, you should be okay. But early blight overwinters in your garden. And so you especially don't want to plant tomatoes. In fact, you don't want to plant anything in the tomato family. So you don't want to plant eggplants or peppers or potatoes, and definitely not tomatoes, because those will also get early blight and be able to, your plants are guaranteed to have that issue. So you want to wait a few years before you plant something like that again.
Susan, sorry.
Yes.
So if you observe this early blight, then you have the 2-year rule. Is that
You should
how it
always
works?
do it, because sometimes there are issues you don't see. You should, but especially when you see disease, right? So you should have a rotation going on in your garden. But if you see a disease problem, then you might want to, some people have pretty small gardens, so crop rotation is very difficult. But if you see something like this, you definitely want to wait a few years, or you're going to have early blight even earlier in the following year.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, another thing that you can use for cultural control is resistant cultivars. So we're really fortunate to I work for Cornell, and they are here in the state of New York. And so they have this really great list of disease-resistant vegetable varieties of every single kind of vegetable. So if you have a problem with early blight on your tomatoes, you can go and look at all the different varieties that are resistant to early blight. That might be a lot because it lists hundreds and hundreds of varieties, but this here is put out by Cornell Garden-Based Learning. It's called the Vegetable Varieties for New York Gardeners. And also, looking at seed packets. If you're online, whether you buy online or in a store, you can always look on the seed packets or look on the online description for things that are resistant to certain diseases, especially if you have that disease problem over and over. Another cultural control is your watering practices. So water is really important, especially when it comes to disease. So overhead watering is probably the most common type of watering. It's probably the easiest type of watering. A sprinkler is pretty cheap. But this can cause some really problems, especially when done improperly, right? So the best time to do overhead watering is in the morning. And that's because if you do it, you want the leaves to dry. The longer the leaves are wet, the more susceptible they are to disease, because most fungal diseases require standing water on the leaves to infect the plant. So if you water in the evening, the leaves will be wet all night long, unless it's super dry, which it doesn't get here in the summertime. It will be wet all night long. So, and then into the morning with the dew in the morning. So they'll be wet for a really long time, which makes them much more likely to get disease. So some alternatives to that would be using a drip irrigation system. So here is one that's set up in a vegetable garden bed, and they are expensive, but they're an investment. You'll use less water. You won't have to water as often. You'll have less problems with disease. Also, another thing, especially out both in your vegetable garden and your landscape, is using mulch, right? Mulch is something that prevents water from evaporation, especially an organic mulch like this. So you'll have to water less often, and therefore you're not going to be wetting the leaves of your plant and causing them to be more susceptible to disease. You can also use soaker hoses. That's another alternative to drip irrigation that's a little bit cheaper. So soaker hoses through your landscape will help prevent the leaves of your plants from being wet all the time. And also there's that splashing effect, right? Disease will splash, right? It's from the ground onto your plant, from one leaf to another, from one plant to another. So overhead watering is something to keep in mind in pest management. So these are the cultural control tactics. There are more, but these are kind of some of the ones that are more common. So remember, think about what you're planting and where. Make sure that you're cleaning tools and noticing what's sick and what's not, so you're not spreading things around your property. Make sure that you're keeping your plants healthy by helping them grow well and giving them the proper fertilizer at the proper time, which you shouldn't be fertilizing your plants unless you're doing a soil sample to see what they actually need. Because adding too much fertilizer can also make them more susceptible. There are some insects that love nitrogen-rich leaves, and you give their plant too much fertilizer and they're just gonna have a feast. Especially in vegetable gardens or any other place you're growing annuals. So if you grow a lot of annual flowers, crop rotation is really important. Finding those resistant cultivars so that you don't have as many issues, and then using proper watering practices so that you're not creating an environment where diseases thrive. All right, so now we're going to move on to physical and mechanical control. This is the second step of our pyramid, right? So you still want to do all those cultural things, and here's something that you can do on top of this. And this is mostly preventative, but also some things are reactions to pests that are there. So this would be a reaction to a pest: hand weeding and rototilling. This is a physical or mechanical control of getting rid of weeds. So sometimes that's really all you can do to get rid of those weeds, especially in a garden with perennials, like weeding around the flowers. Another thing is hand removal. So when it comes to insects, so here we have this beautiful evergreen shrub. And if you look really closely, you can see that there are bagworms all over it. Now, bagworms are super common in Orange County, and they're these caterpillars that once they're born, they start to make this silk cocoon, and then they take the leaves or the needles of whatever it is that they're eating, and they cover it so that they're nice and camouflage. And they continue to feed. They just pop their head out of the sack to feed, so they're very, very well protected. So they're really difficult to treat with pesticides because they're in this very enclosed silken sac. And so the timing has to be perfect, and it can be very difficult. So a really great thing to do is to hand remove these. You can just pluck them off, because if you don't, your bush could look like this. This is the same, these two bushes were planted at the same time in the same place. And one of them had a very heavy infestation with bagworms, and it basically defoliated the bush. And as an evergreen shrub, this is done. This is done for. So if these bagworms here are not removed by hand, which would be easy, this isn't very spiky, it's not very big, it's also going to die. So this would be an example of hand removal of insect pests. Another thing is insect traps. So here we have a burlap barrier trap for spongy moth caterpillars. So spongy moth, which used to be known as the gypsy moth, we had an outbreak last year in this part of the state, in some parts of our county. And so one thing that spongy moth caterpillars do is they go down the tree every evening. And when they're coming up, if you put this nice burlap trap, they'll get trapped in here, and then you can go through and pull them off and put them in soapy water. So this is a really easy trap that anyone can make, and can really help control the spongy moth population on your trees. Another pest that everyone's talking about is the spotted lanternfly. So here are some traps for the spotted lanternfly. So this is a sticky trap. So this is some kind of sticky material that is wrapped around the tree. You'll notice what's really, really important about this trap is this cage on the outside. And this cage is here so that you don't get any bycatch of small mammals or birds. So do not put a sticky trap around your tree unless you also have a cage to put around it, or you'll be killing larger animals, and that's not a good thing. So you can see there's lots and lots of spotted lanternfly this. And then there's also what's called a circle trap. So when the nymphs, spotted lanternfly in general, lots of insects, they go down and then they go back up things. So the nymphs are usually born up high in the tree. The wind blows them down. They don't have any wings yet, so they walk over to the trunk of the tree, and then they have to walk on up. So if they're walking up this tree, they're going to walk into this netting, and they're going to be caught in this circle trap. So that will help manage the population of spotted lanternfly. So another control method is mulch. So we talked about mulch as a cultural control, right, when it has to do with water. It's used as a physical mechanical control when it comes to weeds. So there's lots of different kinds of mulch. So here are some inorganic mulches, right? So this is black plastic. It also helps with water, but the big part of black plastic is it's going to control those weeds. Here we have landscaping cloth, which is more common in landscapes, obviously. So around this tree. And then here, this is actually a stone mulch. It looks like there's some landscaping cloth under this as well, but this is a stone mulch. And then we have our organic mulches, right? So we have some wood chips. And I show this picture here because this is what you should not be doing. This is called volcano mulching. So let me take that X off again. This is called the volcano mulch, and this is going to kill your tree. So there are ways to do these tactics wrong. All of this mulch is up against the base of the tree, creating this really nice warm environment where there's going to be fungal things growing. There's going to be rodents chewing at your tree. There's going to be insect damage. So we don't want a volcano mulch. This picture in the middle is what you really want to do. You want to have a donut. So you should be able to see the root flare. And you should make like a donut around your tree. And usually about to the tree line is what's recommended, especially for small trees. Then there's all these different kind of barriers. So here we have a cutworm collar. So cutworms are little caterpillars that go and they basically cut down your plants in your garden. And so it's really easy to prevent that. All you do is, this looks like some cardboard put in a circle around the tomato plant, and that prevents the cutworm from reaching the plant. And therefore your plant is safe and won't fall down and die. Another great barrier is row cover. So this is garlic that is covered by row cover. So in the springtime here, we have a lovely little maggot that will eat your garlic and your onions. And so you can cover it. It's a fly larvae, and it only flies for about six weeks. And so if you cover your plants just for those 6 weeks, that will prevent the adult fly from laying its eggs and therefore having issues with your garlic. This can also be used for things like cabbage worms and squash bugs and cucumber beetles as a way of protecting especially small plants from having those issues. Or if you have like a little shrub, netting is a really, this is a tree, so covered with netting, this is to prevent Japanese beetle damage. So Japanese beetles they usually don't kill things, but they can definitely kill shrubs if they really like it. So if it's like a peach tree, they can come and really do some significant damage. So just netting it while the Japanese beetles are flying, right, which only fly for, a month and a half, then you can remove the netting. So another is fences. So here are our favorite vertebrates to hate here in Orange County, right? So we have our deer. If you want to fence out a deer, you have to have a minimum 6-foot tall fence. You put a 4-foot fence in, you put a 5-foot fence up, and they'll jump right on over it. And then these lovely groundhogs, they're the most common problem in community gardens that have that lovely fence. And so a way to fence them out is to, when you're it's hard to do this retrofitting it, but if you're putting up a new fence, what you do is you make an L shape. So you put the fence a foot down and a foot out. So when they dig right into that fence. So those are some, that's a physical way of preventing these creatures from feasting on your garden for the most part. Now groundhogs can also climb fences, but they really like digging. That's their favorite thing to do. So those are our physical and mechanical trolls, so all those things can be used to manage pests, keep them out of your garden or remove them from your gardens. So now we're going to move into biological control. So this is the third part of our pyramid. Again, we're moving up prevention. So biological control, right? You can't use that. It can be used preventatively. Like you can have the biological control agents in your garden, but a lot of the times, they're not going to do anything until the pests are there. So as an entomologist, I wanted to show you some pictures of some beautiful, beautiful insects. So we have lots and lots of predators in our gardens. We have lots of ground beetles taking care of, eggs and little creatures that crawl on the ground. We have wheel bugs that use their beaks to stab things and suck out the juices. This is a syrphid fly larvae. It loves to eat aphids. Robber flies, they look kind of like house flies, but they are predatory and will nab things out of the air. It looks like it's eating a little wasp. And this is one of my favorites, is a lacewing larvae. They're called alligators because except their jaws go in the opposite direction and they just feast on aphids. Then we also have parasitoids. So what a parasitoid is a wasp or a fly that lays its egg on some life stage of the pest, and the egg will hatch, and it's the larvae from that egg that will then kill the insect. So here we have an aphid parasitoid wasp. So the wasp will lay its egg inside of the aphid. The larvae will consume the aphid from the inside out, and then the adult will then exit through the mummified aphid. So if you ever see aphids all over leaves, take a good look, and it wouldn't be surprising if you saw these mummies. You can see them because they have these perfect circular holes, and they're also a different color than the aphids. So these are very common, and it's a reason that it's important to protect our parasitoids. So here's another common parasitoid. This is a tomato hornworm parasitoid. So again, this one lays lots of eggs on the tomato hornworm. They go inside and they eat the poor creature from the inside out. And then when this is their pupal casing, right? So they have pupal casings, they pupate outside, and then they emerge. And there's hundreds of them on every single one. This is why when I found a tomato hornworm, what I usually do is I take it off my tomato plant and then I rear it on tomato leaves that I give it elsewhere, just because they're very commonly parasitized and I don't want to kill off those parasitoids. One last parasitoid, this one I think is the most beautiful. This is a trichopid fly. So this will lay its egg. You can kind of see the egg here on this squash bug. So this will then eat the inside of this harlequin bug or the squash bug and kill it from the inside out. Predators and parasitoids are really great at controlling pests, and so we want to conserve them. We want to make sure that they can thrive in our gardens. So here are some ways in which you can help in their conservation. So one thing is providing alternative food sources, i.e. pollen. So a lot of predators like lady beetles, they love eating aphids, but they will also eat pollen. So if they can't find an aphid, they'll eat pollen, and so that will sustain them so that when aphids appear again, they'll still be in your garden. So planting things, this is a family in the Apiaceae family. It has that umbel flower. It produces lots of pollen, and so insects love to hang out on them and eat the pollen. Also providing hosts for your parasitoids, right? If every time you saw aphids, you were killing all of them as quickly as possible, then you're not providing the host for the parasitoid, so that when you go on that vacation for that 1 week, and there's an aphid outbreak, there won't be any parasitoids around to take care of them. So, not eradicating all of the pests on site will help, preserve your parasitoids. Also protecting overwintering sites. So here's a lovely garden in the springtime. This person didn't take down all of their flowers and all of the stubble, because that provides some overwintering sites for some beneficial insects. They'll clean it up probably soon as things are starting to come up. That also provides nesting sites. A lot of ground bees, they will nest in the hollow stems of flowers. So if you're cutting everything down, they're not going to have anywhere to overwinter, and then they're not going to be around your garden. And then also reducing pesticide use. So one of the things with pesticides, so a lot of the pesticides we use now are much less toxic to vertebrates, which is great. So they're not doing as much harm as they once were. Birds aren't falling out of the sky, like when DDT was used. So they're very specific to insects, but they're very specific to all insects. All insects, they target things like they're molting, and so all insects molt. And so it affects all insects. So reducing your pesticide use will help protect the predators and the parasitoids, which are helping manage the pests in your garden. So another type of biological control is augmentation. So this is where you can actually buy and release predators and or parasitoids in your garden. There are several companies that sell them. These pictures are taken from Copert. You can buy, basically you buy this bottle of predatory mites. It comes in like a sawdust material, and then you sprinkle it on your garden. They're specific for the pests that you have. They're very commonly used in greenhouses. It's not something that I highly recommend, but it's kind of a really cool thing. You make sure if you're going to do some augmentation that you're buying from someone who knows what they're doing, like a company like Copert. There's also IPM Labs in Locke, New York, which is another company that sells these things. Because if you just go on Amazon and buy lady beetles, you don't know what you're getting. They're probably not going to survive very long, and that's not a good tactic just to buy random things. You want to buy from a company that is actually producing these things for control. Then another biological control is entomopathogenic nematodes or roundworms. So here we have a beautiful grub that has been infested with entomopathic nematodes. So what happens is the juveniles will go through the spiracles, which let air in and out of the organism, and they just kind of take over and kill the grub from the inside out. This is actually a biological control for grubs. If you do find grubs in your lawn and they are over threshold, this is one way of taking care of them, by using some entomopathogenic nematodes. So those are the three kinds of biological control. We have our conservation, so you're doing things to help the insects thrive in your garden. Then you can also add things to your garden, and then you can also release some entomopathogenic nematodes. But they're very specific, so if you're buying those, you want to make sure that you're buying the correct kind for whatever that you're trying to deal with. All right, so that leads us to the last step in our pyramid, which is the chemical control. So this is the top part of our pyramid. So this is the one that you should use as last resort. This isn't something you go to first, right? You should have done all of your cultural controls and physical and mechanical controls and biological controls before you get to the chemical control. Now, there are things that you need to use chemicals for. For example, if you wanted to get rid of a tree of heaven. I was recently at a webinar from Penn State, and they said, if you want to get rid of tree of heaven and you're not comfortable using pesticides or herbicide, then don't do anything, just let it grow. Tree of heaven is very invasive. It puts out thousands upon thousands of seeds. It's also the favorite for the spotted lanternfly. But if you're not comfortable using a herbicide, it is better to leave it go, because if you cut it down and you don't use a herbicide, it's just going to put out 100 more. So, keeping that in mind. So some chemicals are necessary to do certain things, but they shouldn't be our go-to for every pest problem that we have. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten emails on our garden helpline where it says, oh, I sprayed my tomato plant with X. Can you tell me what's wrong with it? That's the complete opposite of where you're supposed to be going to. If we think of the IPM process, the first thing you want to do is identify what it is. The first thing isn't taking action. So if you do get to a point where you need to use chemical control, it's really important that you read the label. The label is the law. So before you use any pesticide, you should read the entire label. It has really important information on what you can use it for, what it's effective on, as well as dosages, how much you should use, how often you can use it, what protective equipment you should be wearing when you use it, how long you need to stay away from it before once you use it, how often you can use it. So also there's usually, warnings like this is very toxic to invertebrates. This is very toxic to bees. So it's very important that you read the entire label before using any chemicals because the label is the law. So there's lots of different kinds of pesticides. Most of them are very specific. So we have acaricides, which kill mites. We have insecticides that kill insects. Fungicides kill fungi. Herbicides kill plants. And rodenticides kill rodents. There's more, but these are the most common ones that you'll find and use as a home gardener. I just want to take a second to talk about organic pesticides. Some people say I only use organic pesticides. So I just want to tell you what that means, something that is organic. So it's typically not synthetic, right? So it's found in nature typically. So it does not, but it does not include all natural substances. It can have other things, inert ingredients that are not necessarily natural. This is the most important thing. I want to highlight this. Natural origin does not mean low toxicity. So there are some organic pesticides that are more toxic than non-organic pesticides. So just because it's organic, actually, it is not safe. Pesticides are not safe. You should never say that pesticide is safe. And so organic pesticides are not necessarily lower risk or safer than conventional pesticides. So that is a common misconception. Oh, it's fine. It's organic. That means they didn't use pesticides or the pesticides are safe. No pesticides are safe. So keep that in mind. Organic just means that it is, not synthetic. So here are some things that you'll see on labels of organic pesticides. So if they have EPA approval of being organic, we'll have this symbol right here that says for organic gardening. And if they go the extra step to be listed by the Organic Materials Review Institute or OMRI, they'll have these symbols here. Now, a lot of the things that you would be buying as a home gardener would just have the EPA because this is really for people that are going to be selling their products and they want them to be organic. This is more for a home gardener, but just keep that in mind. That's what this means. If you see this and not this, that's just because they didn't go through the extra step because it's only for home gardeners and that's not necessary. So there's things to keep in mind. I was talking about, how beneficial insects are really affected by pesticide use. University of California's IPM has put together this really great resource for bee precaution pesticide ratings. So you can go on there and you can put in a pesticide and it will tell you how safe it is for bees specifically. So some of them have no bee precautions. Some of them, you don't want to allow drift on plants when they're flowering, including weeds. And some of them you don't want anytime there's any flowering thing. So that's something if you, taking care to think about bees and how things are being applied, that drift can really affect things. So there are some minimal risk pesticides, which means they have a lot lower risk for things. And there's a list put out by the EPA and the New York DEC, the New York State DEC. So just keep in mind that pesticide regulations change from state to state, and New York State in this area has some of the most strict pesticide rules. California's #1 and New York's #2. So just because you see it in Pennsylvania at the store doesn't mean it's legal to use here in New York State. But these minimal risk ones, those are ones that the risk is very low for both you and other things. It includes a lot of oils.
If New York laws are different from Pennsylvania laws, would you be confident that everybody selling gardening products in New York State would know about that law and make sure that they're only selling things that are allowed in New York? Are there maybe small garden shops where they're sort of oblivious and they got stuff shipped to them and here you go?
I can't be 100% sure, but pesticides are highly regulated. And so if you're selling pesticides, if you're a pesticide dealer, you should be well aware of that. You should be a licensed pesticide seller. And so you'd have to know that if you're doing it legally, you would know that things are different from state to state. But that doesn't prevent people from going to other states and buying things and bringing them back, which is the issue. That's why it's always important to read the label. And, if you go online and buy pesticides, some stores have been called out for selling things to states that they're not allowed in. But, some of them have gotten good and you'll see like will not ship to certain states. And that's because in those states, this is not something that can be used, while in other states it can be. And there's lots of different reasons for that. Also here in New York State, Long Island has its own rules.
I noticed that Pamela has a question in the chat. I could read it to you.
Sure, that'd be great.
She said, we had a company spray last year for ticks and mosquitoes. I'm very sensitive. Pamela's very sensitive to bites. They said it was natural. I don't want to use them again. Will I have even more this year, or have I ruined it for butterflies and birds this year?
So yeah, as I said, the word natural means very little. The word natural just means that, it wasn't synthetic. That does not mean it's safe. That doesn't mean it's going to be not harm anything. So Also things like mosquitoes and ticks, right? Ticks are coming into your yard all the time. They come on mice, they came on deer. So unless you're keeping out all vertebrates, which is almost impossible, there are gonna be, ticks around. Mosquitoes as well, mosquitoes fly. So a lot of these treatments aren't going to be effective from year to year. So I would say that long-term effects on the ecosystem in your yard is probably negligible, just because of the way that those pests kind of get around. But yeah, if you're ever going to get something sprayed, it's what I would want a list of what chemicals you're going to be using, so that I can do my own research on the chemicals and decide whether I think that, whether what I read from, the EPA, there's some really great resources put out by certain extensions that will give you risks associated with certain chemicals. So yeah, I'm not going to get into all the other things, but I just want to, there are biopesticides. So things like BT is a biopesticide, where it's actually a bacteria that you can spray. So that, again, low risk. They're organic pesticides. Now that doesn't mean low risk, but it's really important to think about beneficials when you're using pesticides. Look for minimal risk pesticides when possible. And then, there's conventional pesticides, which, they're out and about. Sometimes it's really necessary if you really want to get rid of something like tree of heaven or some other, especially with weeds. There are certain weeds that without using herbicides, you're not going to get rid of them. So, keep that in mind. Pesticides shouldn't, some people don't use any pesticides, but in the philosophy of integrated pest management, pesticides are not bad. They're just not the first thing that you use, and they only are used when they become necessary. Just remember that if you're going to use pesticides, read the label, because the label is the law. And again, the title of this talk was reducing pesticide use with integrated pest management. And you can see from all the tactics that we talked about this evening, right? Pesticides should not be the first thing that you go to. You have cultural controls, you have physical and mechanical controls, you have biological controls, and then if you need them, their chemical controls are there. But if you use them in that order, you're really going to reduce the amount of pesticides that you need in your gardens. So just to review, we talked about integrated pest management, what that means. We talked about the process, where you start with identifying the pest, and then learning more about the pest, monitoring, deciding whether you need to manage the pest before going on and taking an action, and then always following up with some evaluation to see if it actually worked. And then we went through pretty thoroughly the different kinds of control tactics that there are: cultural, physical, mechanical, biological, and chemical.